Hello! Oh, right. Oh, the day's over, nearly. Hello, my name's Derek Bailey. For those who don't know me, I've been a wood turner now for over 40 years. Well, 41 really, and 8 of them I've been teaching. This video is a little bit different to the ones I've done previously. I'm in the process of designing a machine based on a retired broken lathe, a Fox lathe, what they call a MIDI lathe. The starter, the motor is just kaput, and it cost me more money to put it right than what the lathe would be worth. So I found a new life for it, and it involves making something like this. An embellished, could call it an urn or something like that, out of plain timber. Mahogany is a very plain timber, very bland unless you're lucky enough to get feathered, which is quite expensive timber. If you can get feathered mahogany, well done. But most mahogany is plain, and the whole idea of embellishing mahogany is to give it a bit of a wow factor. As you can see, there's plenty of embellishments on here, and I designed a lathe to do it, and that's what the next 3 videos are involved in. This is part 1, and I'll introduce you to the lathe, how I made it, and etc. You can go into some really expertise with what we call ornamental wood turning. I'm just touching the periphery, if you like, of ornamental wood turning. It derives from, I think, is it King Charles I, I think, did it in the 15th century. George III, I think, something like that. And it goes back quite a long time in history. It was ornamental turning, and things were made out of brass later on. And they're quite Holtzaffel, if I'm pronouncing it rightly, Holtzaffel lathes were quite intricate design machines, and only the rich could really afford them. So it was an indulgence of the rich, was ornamental wood turning. Now it's introduced with the introduction of stepper motors and things like that. It's become quite a sophisticated clique of people that engage in its curiosities. But I'm just touching the edge of it. I'm just making as simple an ornamental lathe as I can. There's not a great deal of engineering expertise gone into it. It's just basically a Heath Robinson setup, if you like, but it works to a satisfaction, and that's all I'm bothered about at the moment. I haven't the energy or the time or the money to go into the sophistications that it can create. Anyway, that's enough waffling. Let's get on. There are quite a few similar design from different manufacturers of this type of lathe. Mine, the Fox lathe, is quite old. I'd say it's about 30 years old. So if you do find some old ones, it may be an opportunity for you to try it. Here it is, what's left of my poor tired old lathe. Let's see if I can give it a new life. I made 2 rectangles out of glued together 12mm plywood, making 24mm thick each. There's dogs that at the bottom to fit the gap in the lathe. It's just a bit wider than the bed, about 15-20mm either side. As accurately as possible, I drilled 2 6mm diameter holes either side of the headstock front and back, and then completed a countersink by using a larger drill. To line up with the countersunk holes in the headstock, I've inserted 2 bearings front and back in each rectangle so that they line up perfectly horizontally. It will become apparent later. Using my little engineering lathe, I turned 2 spikes, 8mm diameter shaft to fit into the bearings. If you haven't got a lathe, I've looked on the internet at Amazon and I've found some spikes that may be suitable to use in the same way. I'm now going to connect the 2 rectangles via 4 M8 threaded bars, and lining up the spikes with the dimples in the headstock. The rectangle being used at the back of the headstock has had 4 M8 insert nuts incorporated into the holes for screwing the M8 threaded bars into. The reason I'm doing that is so that I only need to put 1 nut on each bar to lock it in place. As you can see, the headstock now rocks on the plywood supports. This is essential for the new lathe that I'm going to make. Now the headstock's in position, it's just a simple matter now of making a piece to fit the dogs at the bottom of the plywood extension, in order that I can lock the headstock to the bed of the lathe. In this project I'm going to use quite a few insert nuts. They're okay from Amazon, quite cheap, but they're made of zinc, not mild steel, so they have a tendency to split. So when you're drilling the hole, make sure that it's about 0.5 millimeter bigger than the core the largest part of the core diameter of them. There is a slight taper on them, so make sure that you measure the biggest size of the taper in the core diameter. The next procedure is to incorporate some pulleys under the bed of the lathe to drive the shaft, the drive shaft of the lathe. So I've made a wooden pulley plate which will fix to the end of the lathe, as you'll see as we go along. Incorporated in this pulley plate are two 8mm bore bearings inserted into the wood. To make it a lot easier, I'd advise you to get some taps, M8 and M6 taps. Fortunately, the headstock of this lathe is cast iron, and it accepts threads very easily, so you don't need to buy expensive high-speed steel taps. Mild steel taps should be quite adequate. As you can see, I've pre-drilled and tapped the underside of the headstock to accept the pulley plate, and I've created a slot in the wood so that I can adjust the tension of the belts that's going to connect the pulleys together. I need to extend the shaft, the drive shaft of the lathe. This is probably the only specialised piece accessory that needs to be fit. If you do know someone who has an engineering lathe, it's not a difficult job to make. I have a small model maker's lathe which accomplishes this quite adequately, but if you know someone who can just machine this part for you, then that's really the only difficult part to acquire, really. The drive shaft of the lathe has a keyway in it, which makes it quite convenient. I've made a pulley out of plywood and just filed a keyway to suit the key that's in the keyway of the shaft. This is the main drive pulley of the lathe, so it needs to be reasonably substantial and not vulnerable to flexing, so I've glued an extra piece on it to make it a bit thicker where it goes over the shaft. I've used a spade bit, put it on a lathe, turned a V groove on the circumference to accept a circular belt, which you'll see later on. When I was making this pulley, I made a hub about 2-inch diameter, something like that, to accept an M4 machine screw, and I put an M4 insert nut into it so that I could secure the pulley to the drive shaft of the lathe. I'm going to control the headstock pulley with a pulley system that will be slung under the bed of the lathe on the pulley plate. It consists of a large diameter pulley, probably as big as you can get underneath the lathe, but the bigger the pulley on this system, the better the power ratio is, so that you can turn the pulley pretty easily. If you have a small pulley, it'd be harder to move the headstock pulley. The pulley directly under the headstock pulley is about half the size of the pulley under the bed of the lathe. This gives probably a 2-to-1 ratio, and again it makes it easier to turn the headstock pulley with little effort. That'll become apparent later. I've used a 8mm threaded bar to hold the pulleys, which obviously go through the bearing in the pulley plate. To ensure that the pulley ran freely and wasn't clamping to the cast iron framework, I put a split washer between the pulley and the bearing in the bearing plate, making sure that the split washer wasn't larger than the inner bearing, so that the thrust, when I tightened the nuts up, didn't clamp the pulley and prevent it from turning. Here I've put another insert nut into the circumference of the pulley and put in an M4 machine screw to tighten it to the threaded bar shaft. Here I've made two small pulleys out of plywood again and inserted the 8mm bearings into them, and I'm going to mount them onto the support plate, the rear support plate on the headstock. I'm just cutting the bolt to length with my little Parkside battery operated angle grinder. It's very useful for little things like this, saves using hacksaw. I'm just putting a slot in the bolts. There isn't enough clearance to use a spanner, so I'm putting a slot in. I can use a screwdriver to fix up the two small tension pulleys. I had previously fixed the pulleys just using a normal wood screw, but by using these bolts it gives a lot better purchase. It's just that I've got to drill a larger hole to put the M8 insert nuts into the plywood. I'm using a 6mm diameter solid polyurethane belt to connect the pulleys. I've included a link to show you how to weld the two ends together when you've cut them to length. It's quite easy, but you need a blowtorch. In order to reduce belt slippage round the pulleys, I need to create quite a large arc of contact, and the reason for using the tension pulleys, as you'll see, so that the arc of contact is good and strong enough so that there won't be too much belt slip. This is a two-step pulley I made out of plywood for a previous project. It comes in useful for this one. I'll only be using the smaller diameter of the two pulleys and the larger diameter to fix a handle to. Again, I've made a small tension pulley so that I can, as I said before, I can create a large arc of contact on all the pulleys. The tension slider is basically a bungee cord which gets hold of the headstock and allows it to move under tension. This is essential for what I want the lathe to do. For this I'm using OSB, which apparently is oriented strand board. It's cheaper than plywood, and for this purpose it's not essential that it's perfectly flat and smooth. I use my makeshift router table, which I'd shown in a previous video. It's quite easy to set up, and I used it to make these sliders, which by using a dovetail cutter. I made a long length about 2 foot long, and I can chop it to length, and I've used about three lengths in this project. I'm using a cut down bungee cord here. I had tried using elastic bands, but I had to keep winding them round to create a thickness, which is what basically a bungee cord is. So it was far easier, and it already had a hook on it. So yeah, I'm quite happy using this bungee cord. It gives me the right amount of tension, and obviously by having a slider I can adjust that. I drilled and tapped an M8 threaded hole in the rear of the headstock to hold the bungee cord. This lathe is becoming more like a colander every day. At the rear of the lathe I need to make a little table that fits on top of the rear of the lathe casting. I've had to make 2 little M2 threaded holes in order to fix the base to it. Because the wooden dovetail track that I've made projects above the table, I need to make it flush. So I've put a secondary table and attached that to it so that it's all one level, one height. I could have recessed the base table, but that would have weakened the table itself, and I need it to be reasonably strong for what I want to do. I've used OSB for the pillar, and for the base I managed to find a bit of laminated plywood, which is quite good if you want to slide. If you want it to slide, it's quite smooth. It's basically a plastic covering on plywood. It's something I had left over, so it comes in useful. This is the follower. I could have made it out of plastic, but I didn't have any plastic that was strong enough or rigid enough. So I've used a very, very small bearing and sandwiched it in the plywood between two thin aluminium plates and filed it to shape. It's double-ended, which I can use a small bearing for tight crevices and a larger bearing if I wanted a more broader profile. Well, I've made the follower. Now it's time to put on the things for it to follow. The first cam disc, as you can see, is made out of plywood, which I made myself on the drill, on the pillar drill, and the divider. You probably need to access someone with a 3D printer to make the other cams. You can design your own cam shapes, there's no restriction really. I was lucky enough to find someone who did them for me. You can make your own in plywood, but you've got to be pretty accurate, and it's quite time consuming. So if you do know somebody with a 3D printer, all the better. In order for the follower to follow the cam accurately, you need to set the follower at the lowest point in the cam, and that will allow the bungee cord to take up any slack. If you use the high point of the cam, that's not always possible, and you could end up with a false cutting action. This particular cam has quite a severe change in direction, which makes using the hand wheel very difficult without creating belt slip. So you need to aid the rotation by hand and persevere with the tension in the bungee cord. It works, but you've got to play around with it. So sometimes the design of the cams can make the belt slip, but I get away with it later on. When I'm machining the profiles using the cams, it needs to be accurate representation of the cam, and any slight movement in the table makes it very difficult. So I'm making the table even more secure by screwing it to the bungee pillar. The final assembly to this machine is fixing the table or platen to the bed of the lathe. I've again drilled into the bed of the lathe and tapped it M5, I think it is in this occasion. Drilled and tapped the bed of lathe M5 so that I can use M5 countersunk machine screws to fix them. You'll notice I've created a diamond pattern on the table, and at each intersection of the lines I've put an insert nut for an M6 threaded bar, which will be used for clamps, and positioning of the next item, which will be a vise, a special vise. I'm just re-emphasizing the lines as they are worn away a little bit, so I'm just re-establishing the lines. The next purchase is an XY vise. It's a bit rough and ready, but it's quite adequate for what use I'm going to put it to. For those who are not familiar with an XY vise, it's basically a vise to hold anything, and you can position it north and south and east and west, if you like, to oversimplify it, accurately to within probably a tenth or perhaps 100th of a millimetre or 1,000th of an inch, depending on the dials on the handles. Here I've made a little jig that fits in securely into the vise and is clamped by it, and it will receive the next purchased item, a router. I've put little notches in the jig to fit the width of the jaws of the vise, so that I can relocate it accurately if I need to remove it for some reason. Here it is, the Trend T4 EK portable router. It's a corded router, but the beauty of this is you can remove the motor, and it has a standard, I think, 43mm collar, which can be used to hold it in the jig as you've seen earlier. It's a very versatile router. It's quite powerful for its size and is highly recommended. It's great for a starter router, and the uses it can provide are innumerable. So I'd recommend this router, not just for this purpose I'm using it, but as a general router for jobs around the workshop. I'm going to grip the collar of the router in this jig, and I've cut out a circular hole 43mm to suit the collar of the router, cut it in half and put good old insert nuts in, M6 insert nuts into the top so that it can be screwed and clamped to the collar. I've designed the jig so that the router, when it's mounted in it, has the same centre height as that of the lathe, and I've done it so that the jig rests directly on the bottom of the jaws of the vise. In order to position and hold the vise to the table, I've made some simple little plywood clamps, as you can see. You can make these any lengths, and because of the insert nuts in the table, I can position these clamps at salient points as I move the vise into different positions. You may have wondered why I've put lines diagonally, vertically and horizontally on the table. The reason for that is I can use a piece of plywood as a straight edge, clamp it to the table and use it as a guide for the vise so that I can position the vise and move it in linear directions accurately without losing the track of its movement. Here is another plywood clamping design. It gives it it's a stronger clamp, and it has a bit more projection, and it's probably easier to fit as well, quicker to fit, but they all serve the purpose well. By introducing this wood slide, I can quickly position the vise along the same axis as the fine adjustment of the vise. Because of the infinite permutations of the shapes and patterns that can be produced, I need to have a guide before I start cutting expensive wood. So I've rigged up a paper holder to see the outcome of my selections. I've just turned a normal pencil into a cylinder to fit the collet in the router. Sharp angles and deep penetration into the periphery of the roses can determine whether I'll get belt slip and ruin the cutting action. So I've got to be careful with my bearing selection on the follower. I tend to go for a finer bearing where the shapes aren't too pronounced, and a larger bearing where there's a lot of penetration and very acute changes in direction. This puts a load on a small bearing and stops the rows from turning properly. There is a big disadvantage using a normal pencil. Because the paper holder is slightly out of square, it puts a pressure onto the point of the pencil at a certain position, and I've had a few lead breakages, so I'll have to think of a better way. By moving the vise towards the upward rotating part of the lathe, the shaft, I can get a mirror image of the one that I did on the downward rotation of the lathe. If you look closely, I made a mistake. The lead broke in the pencil, and by replacing the pencil I couldn't get the same position, so I've got a sort of double line effect. The rolls that I've selected here has quite pronounced shapes on it, and it's too severe for the fine bearing. It would stop the rolls from rotating properly, so I'm changing, as I mentioned earlier, I'm changing to a larger bearing. As you can see, it's no longer a pencil. I got fed up with the lead breaking, so I've used a wax crayon, which wears very quickly, so I substituted that later on for a solid graphite pencil. Chopped the end off and just made a stub so it would go into the router tip. Well, that's it. I hope you like it. If any of you want to take up an introduction into ornamental turning, then there's quite a few videos on YouTube about it. I'll put some of the links on the description of this video. There's one particular one which gave me an inclination to start doing it and gave me some ideas. Is one made of MDF, and that sort of set the ball rolling, and I utilised some of their ideas into my design. Anyway, like I said, I'll put a link on the description of this video. There'll be links to other things as well. If you found that you like my videos, or indeed this video, it would be nice if you could subscribe and click the like button. It motivates me to do more. I get a great deal of pleasure in passing on my ideas and getting feedback from them. So all the best to you, and take care.